He pulled a stranger off a train in the middle of the Utah desert, a woman someone had just tried to kill. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her secret. And he had no idea that saving her life would force him to face the one thing he had been running from for 10 years. This story teaches us that the bravest thing is not drawing your gun. It's finally setting down what you've been carrying alone and letting someone stand beside you while you do it. This channel is home to stories born from the dust and silence of the Old West, where cowboys carry wounds they never talk about, where love arrives without warning, and where the most powerful thing one person can offer another is simply the choice to stay. If this story moved something in you, leave a comment. Even just a single word tells us you are here. Like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never ride past a story worth stopping for.
Will Zander had watched plenty of things die in the Utah desert. Hope, cattle. And at least one man he had buried himself with nothing but a flat rock for a marker, and a name he still carried in his chest like a piece of shrapnel that had never worked its way out. He knew the desert well enough to know it had no preference about what it took. It was patient, and it was indifferent, and it had all the time in the world. That October afternoon in 1883, when the woman in the blue dress came off the train like a shot bird, his first thought was not about saving her. His first thought was, the desert has finally figured out how to kill me too. He was sitting beside a creek bed 200 yards north of the railroad tracks, not drinking from it. Ranger was drinking, the big buckskin working through the water with the focused efficiency of a horse that did not have time for sentiment, which was the quality Will had always appreciated most in him. Will was looking at the surface of the creek and running through a list from memory, not a list anyone else would ever see. A list he kept in a small notebook under the floorboards of his cabin and read every Friday evening by the last of the fire. Names, dates, 3 words after each one. My fault. Confirmed. This was not grief. A man Will had once respected, a field surgeon he had ridden with briefly during a cattle drive into New Mexico, had told him that grief was for things you could not have prevented. What Will carried was different. It was more like what a good accountant carries, the knowledge that the books do not balance and will never balance, and you keep the record anyway because pretending the number is smaller than it is only makes the debt worse. He was on the 3rd name when he heard it. The scream came across the flat desert air like a crack in glass, sharp, and then sudden, and then nothing. And Will was on his feet and moving before the nothing had time to settle. That was the Pinkerton reflex, still alive after 6 years of trying to kill it in the silence of the canyon country. His body knew what to do before his mind had voted on the matter. He vaulted onto Ranger and drove his heels in, and the horse went from standing to full gallop in the space of 2 heartbeats, and the October sun hammered down on both of them without apology as they crossed the rocky ground between the creek and the tracks. He did not think about heroism during that ride. He never had, not once in 11 years as a Pinkerton detective, not during any of the operations that people with no experience in such things like to imagine were conducted with some kind of noble fire in the chest. What he thought about was probability. Speed of the train, which he estimated at 35 miles per hour based on the grade of the track east of Moab. Height of the fall, which from the angle he had seen was from the platform between cars, approximately 4 feet above the roadbed. Angle of impact against the embankment. The composition of the ground along that stretch, which was red sandstone gravel with scattered sage. The probability of survival was not high. He could see her now. A shape in the dirt below the embankment, not moving. The blue dress spread around her like something broken open. The train had not slowed. The whistle screamed twice as it rounded east, and the sound faded into the distance, the way all things eventually faded into the distance out here, leaving the silence bigger than it was before. Will reached her in under 3 minutes. He pulled Ranger up hard and was off the horse before the animal fully stopped, dropping to one knee beside her with the trained economy of a man who has done emergency triage in places where the nearest doctor was 4 days away. She was breathing, shallow, ragged, but present. He worked fast, running his hands along her limbs with practiced pressure, feeling for the resistance of a clean bone versus the wrong movement of one that had given way. Her left forearm was badly bruised but intact. Her ribs on the right side made her flinch when he pressed, which told him cracked, possibly two. The gash along her hairline was bleeding the way head wounds do, which looks worse than it usually is but still needed attention. He was reaching for the bandana at his neck when he saw the bruises on her upper arms. He stopped. 4 finger marks on the inside of each arm, one set higher than the other, pressed deep enough that the color was already moving from red toward purple. That pattern did not come from a fall. A fall produces impact bruising, irregular, shaped by whatever surface received the blow. This pattern came from someone standing behind her with both hands, gripping her hard enough to hurt, holding her at the edge before she went over. She was not fallen. She was thrown. Will sat back on his heels and looked at the tracks, and thought about that for exactly as long as he could afford to, which was about 4 seconds. And then he went back to work. Her eyes opened while he was cutting strips from the tail of his shirt to bind the head wound. Green eyes, the particular clear green of shallow canyon water in spring. And they were frightened and in pain, but they were also, even now, assessing him, looking for something. He had interviewed enough people in enough difficult situations to recognize the look of a mind that is still working even when the body it lives in has been badly used. She tried to speak. He told her not to. She spoke anyway. The voice came out barely above a whisper, cracked at the edges, but the words were deliberate and clear. "Don't take me to town. Don't trust the sheriff." Will filed those 2 instructions without comment. He did not ask why. He had learned long ago that the first words a person says after severe trauma are rarely incidental. They say the thing that has been sitting at the front of the mind during whatever came before, the thing they were planning to say if they survived long enough to say it. He lifted her with the efficiency of a man who has moved injured people before and knows that clean speed is more merciful than slow care in the first minutes. She made a sound when he settled her against his chest on the saddle, but she did not cry out. He put his arm around her waist and turned Ranger south, away from the tracks, toward the canyon country, where the red rock walls rose against the blue sky like the walls of something that had been standing for longer than any human trouble. He had a cabin 8 miles west, a line shack he had built 3 years ago and made into something better because he had needed the work to fill the evenings and because a man who builds things with his hands has less room in his head for the things he is trying not to think about. It was remote. Nobody knew about it except him and one other man, and he would deal with that particular complication later. First, he needed to get her there before she lost what little she had left. He glanced back once as he rode. The train had disappeared into the horizon, swallowed by distance and heat shimmer. But on the roof of the last car, in the last moment before it vanished, he had seen something that he had not processed until now, and was processing carefully. A man standing on the roof of the last car, still as a fence post, watching through a field glass, still watching until the train took him out of sight. Will turned forward and rode. Ranger picked his way through the canyon approaches as the afternoon light began to lean west, painting the sandstone walls in shades of red and amber that had no counterpart in any other landscape Will had ever seen, and he had seen a considerable number of landscapes in his 40 years on this earth. The woman in his arms drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was under, he held her carefully and watched the ground for loose rock. When she surfaced, she was quiet and still, conserving herself with a discipline that told him she had been in difficult situations before and knew how to behave in them. Once, she said very quietly, without opening her eyes, "Are you taking me to town?" "No," he said. She did not speak again until they reached the cabin. The cabin sat at the back of a small box canyon, invisible from any main trail, surrounded on three sides by sandstone walls that held the heat of the day long after the sun went down. Will had put more care into it than a line shack warranted. Stone fireplace built from flat red rock he had cut and laid himself over 2 winters. A real plank floor, a door with a solid bar across the inside that would hold against anything short of a battering ram. He had not built it as a refuge when he built it. He had built it because he needed something that required that level of attention. Right now it looked like the best thing he had ever made. He carried her inside and laid her on the bunk, and set about building a fire and heating water with the focused competence of a man who does not panic, and never has, or if he does it quietly and on his own time. The head wound needed cleaning first. He worked by firelight, washing away the dried blood with water and then with whiskey, feeling her flinch under his hands, but holding remarkably still for someone in that much pain. The gash was 3 inches along the hairline. It needed stitching, but he would not attempt that until she was conscious enough to be reasonably still. He bandaged it with strips from a clean shirt he kept folded in the chest by the wall, and moved to the ribs, binding them with firm pressure that made her draw a sharp breath through her teeth. When he finished, he made coffee and sat in the chair by the fire, and looked at her in the firelight and thought about the man with the field glass on the roof of the last car. Patient he had been. That kind of patience was not accidental. That was the patience of a man who had done this before, and knew that the work was not finished when the woman went over the side. The work was finished when someone confirmed the result, which meant someone would be looking. And the only person who knew about this canyon was Cole Draper, and Will had not spoken to Cole in 4 months. And he thought about that for a long time in the chair by the fire, while the woman in the blue dress breathed in the bunk across the room, slow and shallow and alive. He was still thinking about it when she cried out in her sleep. He was on his feet before the sound had fully formed, crossing to the bunk and catching her wrists before she could tear at the bandage around her head. She came up fighting, the way people do when the nightmare has been built from something real, and he held her wrists with careful firmness and kept his voice level and low. "Easy now. You are safe. Nobody is going to hurt you here." It was the voice he used with spooked horses. It worked on people, too, more often than not. Her eyes opened, wild, unfocused, scanning the ceiling. Then they found his face and stayed there while whatever she was running from in the dream receded. "Where?" she said. "Canyon country. 8 miles west of where I found you. My cabin. You have been out for about 4 hours." She took stock. He watched her do it, watched her run the inventory the same way he had seen her do it when she first opened her eyes beside the tracks. Hands, ribs, head, where she was, who she was with. "You haven't taken me to town," she said. "Said I wouldn't." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm Delilah Jameson," she said, "and I am in a great deal of trouble, and I have put you in a great deal of trouble, and I am sorry for it." "Will Zander," he said, "run cattle in this country. Tell me the rest when you can sit up." He went to make broth from the dried stores in the cabinet by the wall, and while he worked he listened to the desert outside. And the desert was quiet, and the quiet was the kind that feels like the space before something, rather than the space after. He had learned to tell the difference. The cabin was not what Delilah had expected. She had expected a line shack, which was to say, she had expected 4 walls and a dirt floor, and the smell of accumulated neglect that accumulated in spaces where men lived alone without caring about the accumulation. She had grown up in Denver, in a house with 12 rooms and 2 servants and a father who believed strongly in the civilizing power of order, and she had a corresponding tendency to read character from physical surroundings that she had learned to be honest with herself about, because it was not always accurate, and it was occasionally unfair. This was not a line shack. The floor was real planking, worn smooth by years of boots but kept clean. The stone fireplace had been built with attention, the rock selected and fitted with the kind of care that does not come from necessity, but from the satisfaction of doing a thing correctly. There was a shelf with 3 books on it. She lay in the bunk and looked at the shelf while the man called Will Xander moved around the cabin with the economical quiet of someone who had long ago made peace with his own company. And she read the 3 books the way she read most things, which was as a text about the person who owned them. Marcus Aurelius, the Meditations, spine cracked in several places and worn most severely in the middle sections. A surveying manual, practical and well used. A Protestant Bible with nothing underlined in it and no ribbon marking a page, which was the most interesting detail of the 3. A man who kept a Bible but did not use it was keeping it for a reason that had nothing to do with reading it. And beneath one of the floorboards near the east wall, a slight unevenness in the plank, a place where the wood sat about a 1/4 inch higher than the boards around it. She noticed it because she noticed things. She had spent 4 years teaching in the poorest schools in Denver, and you learned quickly in that environment to see what was present and what was absent and what was being deliberately concealed, because hungry children were expert concealers, and you could not help them if you could not see them clearly. She filed the floorboard, said nothing about it. Will brought her broth and sat in the chair across the room and watched her eat with the steady attention of a man running a quiet assessment. She ran one back at him over the rim of the cup, broad through the shoulders, hands that had done significant work, a face that had been weathered by outdoor years into something angular and settled, the kind of face that had stopped bothering to manage what it revealed because it had long ago run out of things it was afraid to show, or had decided that managing it required more effort than it was worth. She tried a test. She asked him a deliberately wrong question about the road into Moab from the west, putting the canyon pass a mile north of where it actually was, framing it as a casual question from someone unfamiliar with the territory. He corrected her without hesitation, gave her the accurate bearing, and then did not ask why she had asked. He simply returned to watching her eat. That was interesting. A man trying to charm her would have made something of the correction, would have used it as an opening. A man who was simply cataloging information had no reason to turn it into conversation. She gave him the trimmed version of Gerald, the embezzlement, the attorneys who had blocked the incompetency proceedings, the business associate her uncle had tried to force on her in marriage, the decision to run east toward her father's sister in Boston. He listened without commentary, which was also interesting. Most men, when a woman told them she was being hunted by her own family, responded with some version of reassurance or disbelief. Will Xander responded with the concentrated stillness of someone processing information for operational relevance. When she finished, he said, "Your father's documents, you still have them?" Not a question. Yes, and that's what he wants, among other things. What else does he want? She met his eyes. To finish what he started on that train platform. He nodded once, the minimal nod of a man registering a data point. And then he went to put more wood on the fire, and she found herself wanting, unexpectedly, to know what he was thinking, which was not a feeling she was accustomed to having about men she had known for less than 6 hours. She asked him what he had done before cattle. The silence that followed was exactly 3 seconds long. She counted it. Then he said, "Someone else." 2 words that contained about as much information as a week of ordinary conversation, if you were paying attention to them correctly. She slept again after that. The broth and the warmth and the particular exhaustion of a body that has absorbed significant damage and is managing the repairs pulled her under before she could object to it. And the last thing she was aware of was the sound of the fire settling, and the man called Will Xander, sitting very still in his chair, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. What she did not know, because she was asleep, was what happened after. After she slept, Will sat for an hour, and then he went to the document case she had been carrying inside her dress, which she had set on the table before she closed her eyes. He did not open it. He looked at it for a long time, and then he went outside to do his perimeter check, which was not a habit he had brought from the canyon country, but from the 11 years before it. 90 yards northeast of the cabin, pressed into a gap between two sandstone slabs where the rock overhang would hide the shape of a man from casual observation, he found horse droppings. He crouched and held his hand near them in the cooling night air. Still warm, not by much, within the last 3 or 4 hours. Someone had been here watching the cabin and had chosen not to move on it. Will straightened and looked out at the dark canyon walls and listened to the desert, which was telling him nothing except that it knew more than he did, which it always did. Patient. That was the word that had come to him when he saw the man on the roof of the last car, and it was the word that came to him now. Whoever was out there was not rushing. He went back inside and barred the door and sat down in his chair and did not sleep until well after midnight. And when he did sleep, it was light and particular, the sleep of a man who is maintaining a watch, even in the dark, behind his eyelids. In the morning, Delilah was sitting up in the bunk when he woke, the Marcus Aurelius open in her lap, reading with the focused absorption of someone who reads not for information, but for the company of a mind she respects. She had found the pages that were worn most severely, the passages he had returned to most often, and she was reading those first. That, he thought, was not the behavior of a banker's daughter who read because she was supposed to. "You've read this a long time," she said without looking up. "About 8 years. Which passages?" He told her the ones he had marked. She found them and read them and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "A man who keeps coming back to the parts about obligation and consequence is a man who has made peace with neither. Or is trying to." She looked up at him then. "Is there a difference?" He thought about that. "Some days," he said. He rode out to check the main ranch after that and was back by mid-afternoon. His hand, Hank, a weathered and reliable man who had worked the property for 3 years and asked no unnecessary questions, had news. 2 strangers had come through Bristow the previous afternoon asking about the ranch, asking specifically about whether Xander ever brought visitors out, whether he had a woman staying with him, whether there was a line shack on the far property. 2 strangers, not 3. Will thanked Hank and rode back to the cabin and told Delilah what Hank had said, and watched her face while she processed it. "My uncle always sends 3 men," she said. "Where is the 3rd one?" "That," Will said, "is a good question." She looked at him steadily. "You already have a theory." "I have the beginning of one." "Tell me." "Not yet. Give me a day to think it through." She held his gaze for a moment with the particular expression of someone deciding whether to push. Then she looked back at the Aurelius and said, "All right, one day." Outside, the October wind moved through the canyon, and the sandstone walls that had been standing since before any human trouble caught the afternoon light and held it, red and amber and older than any name anyone had ever given to any of the things that happened in their shadow. Cole Draper broke up the fight outside the Rusty Spur Saloon on a Tuesday morning when most decent people were still working, and the 2 men rolling in the dust of Center Street in Moab were railroad workers who had been drinking since the previous evening and had arrived at the particular stage of it where old grievances became urgent and physical. He did not draw his gun. He walked into the middle of it and used his voice first and his hands second and had them separated in under a minute, which was about how long it usually took when you knew what you were doing and were not interested in making it dramatic. The one who had taken the worst of it had a cut above his eye that was bleeding in the colorful way of face wounds, and Cole walked him personally to Doc Harmon's office 3 doors down and paid for the bandaging out of his own pocket because the man had no money on him, and because Cole had been a lawman in this county for 9 years and had certain standards about what happened to people on his watch, regardless of whether they had contributed to their own difficulty. He walked back to his office and sat down at his desk and looked at the window that faced east, which was the direction things generally came from that he did not want. The rider from the railhead had come in late the previous night while Cole was doing his last round, slipped an envelope under the office door and was gone before Cole could identify him, which was itself a message. Cole had opened the envelope alone at his desk and read the 2 words inside and sat for a while with the paper in his hands before he burned it in the ashtray. She's alive. He sat at his desk now and thought about Will Zander, and thought about the canyon country north of town, where Will had that line shack nobody was supposed to know about, and thought about the wire he had received from Denver 3 weeks ago with the name at the bottom that had been living in his chest like a coal ever since. A name from 1864, a Union Supply Depot in Tennessee. A decision made by a 23-year-old who was cold and scared and far from home, and had convinced himself that survival was a sufficient moral framework. Gerald Jameson had found it. Gerald Jameson found everything, eventually. Cole called his deputy in and said he needed to ride north to check on some trouble reported near the canyon breaks. His deputy, a solid young man named Patterson who asked fewer questions than any deputy Cole had ever worked with, which Cole had always appreciated, said he would hold down the office. Cole rode out before noon. He told himself he was riding north to warn Will, to give him a quiet word and get the woman moved out of Utah before anyone had to do anything he would regret. He had believed this version of events with reasonable conviction for approximately the first hour of the ride. Then the conviction started wearing thin at the edges, the way conviction does when the story underneath it is not quite honest. And by the time he hit the canyon country, he had stopped pretending he did not know what he was actually riding toward. He was riding toward the choice he had been putting off making since the wire arrived. The trouble with Cole Draper was that he was not a bad man. He was clear enough about himself to know that, even if nobody else was in a position to confirm it, he had become a lawman because he believed in something, or had believed in something when he was young. And the thing he had believed in had been specific enough and real enough that the years had not entirely worn it away. He had done decent work in this county for 9 years. He had walked bleeding railroad workers to the doctor and paid out of his own pocket. And that was not the behavior of a man without genuine convictions. But he had also done something in a supply depot in Tennessee in 1864 that had resulted in a family losing everything they had, and he had carried that for 19 years in the particular private way that men carry things they cannot confess to and cannot put down. And Gerald Jameson had found the thread of it and pulled, and now Cole was on a horse heading north to do something he had not yet made himself define clearly, because defining it clearly would require him to admit what he had become. He reached the south ridge above Will's main ranch as the sun began its long lean toward the western horizon. He sat his horse on the ridge and looked down at the yard below where Hank was unsaddling for the evening. He counted the horses in the corral. There was a gray mare he did not recognize, not from Will's stock. New arrival, recently shod, still carrying some dust from canyon travel. So Will had brought her to the ranch, or someone had passed through. Cole turned his horse toward the deeper canyon country to the north and rode on after dark. At the cabin, 3 days had passed, in the way that days pass, when two people are confined in a small space under the pressure of uncertain danger, which is to say both very slowly and very quickly, the individual hours dragging, and the accumulation of them moving faster than seemed accountable. On day 3, Will taught Delilah to read ground sign. He did not frame it as an offer. He walked her out behind the cabin in the early morning light and put a stick in her hand and showed her what the earth says when something has moved across it. The compression pattern of different weights, the way the disturbed surface dries at different rates depending on the time of day, the specific geometry of a horse's hoof versus a boot heel versus the pad of a coyote. He explained it the way he explained everything, which was without preamble or encouragement, as though the information existed independently of any relationship between the person giving it and the person receiving it. She listened with the same focused attention she gave to books. Then she said, "I'm not a student, and this isn't a classroom." "No," Will said. "Students get to fail their exams and try again. You don't." She held his gaze for a moment. "Fair point," she said, and went back to listening. The exchange had a sharpness to it that both of them recognized, and neither of them was bothered by. It was the sharpness of two people who were not pretending to each other, which was rarer than it should have been in Will's experience, and which he found, to his own mild surprise, to be easier than the alternative. On that same afternoon, she found the notebook. The loose floorboard shifted under her weight when she crossed to the far side of the room, not dramatically, but enough that she felt it underfoot, and stopped and looked down. She crouched without asking permission, and lifted the board and looked at the notebook in the hollow beneath it. She picked it up and opened it to the first page, looked at the name and the date and the 3 words written beneath in a hand that was precise and careful, and had not changed over the years of the entries that followed. My fault, confirmed. She read nothing else. She set the notebook back in the hollow and fitted the board back in place and stood up and went back to what she had been doing. And she did not mention it. Will, who had been watching from across the room with the particular quality of attention that looks like inattention, registered all of this and said nothing either. On day 4, he came back from a perimeter ride earlier than usual and sat at the table and did not eat the food she had heated from his stores, and after a long silence during which the fire talked and the canyon wind moved outside the walls, she asked him, "How many men have you killed?" The question landed in the room without apology. He looked at her. "Enough that I stopped counting the ones I was supposed to, and kept counting the ones I wasn't. I'm asking because I want to know who you are, not to judge you. People always say that second part. People who want to judge you don't warn you first." He looked at her for a long moment. She held it without flinching, which was something he was beginning to understand she was specifically capable of. Then he told her about the man with the lamp. He told it the way he had rehearsed it into himself over 6 years of Friday evenings, which was without color and without mitigation, the way you read from a ledger. The 1877 raid. The farmhouse in darkness outside a town in Missouri that he would not name because naming it made it too present. The shape in the doorway. His training reading the shape as threat, and his body responding to his training before his mind had time to intervene. The sound. The lamp hitting the plank floor and the flame guttering and going out. The face looking up at him in the sudden dark with an expression that was not accusation and was not fear, and was simply surprise, simply the expression of a man who had been handed a piece of information he had not expected. He did not ask for absolution. He did not couch it in context. He stated it as the fact that it was. He had killed a man who was innocent. And he had not found a way to make that mean anything other than what it was, and he had stopped trying to make it mean anything else. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You're carrying it correctly. Most men drop it or pretend it isn't there. The ones who carry it right, they don't stop being dangerous, but they stop being reckless." "What are you carrying?" he said. First time she went silent. Not the silence of someone choosing her words, but the silence of someone who has arrived at a door they have not opened in a long time and is standing in front of it, without quite deciding whether to go through. "My mother," she said finally, and nothing more. He did not push. He got up and put more wood on the fire and let the subject settle where it had landed. On day 5, Will examined the document case with Delilah's permission. He went through the papers methodically, sorting by date, reading each one with the flat professional attention of a man who has spent 11 years sifting documents for the thing that matters from the things that appear to matter. Near the bottom of the case, beneath the financial records and the correspondence with the Denver attorneys, he found an envelope. Older paper, different ink, no name on the outside. He opened it. He read it twice. It was a letter from the Jameson family physician dated 1860, addressed to Delilah's father. The doctor's handwriting was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had thought hard about what he was writing, and had decided that his conscience would not permit him to stay silent, though his silence had lasted 23 years before it found its way into this envelope. Eleanor Jameson had not died of pneumonia. She had come to him 3 weeks before her death in a state of significant distress, describing a sustained campaign of threats from her brother-in-law, Gerald. Threats to ruin her husband publicly through the disclosure of certain business irregularities Gerald had manufactured or discovered, threats against her daughter's prospects, demands that she assist him in accessing the bank's private accounts and ledgers. She had described feeling that she had no way out that did not destroy the people she was trying to protect. Will read it twice and folded it and put it back in the envelope exactly as he had found it. He did not put it back in the document case. He put it in his shirt pocket over his heart, which was where you kept things you were not yet sure what to do with. He sat for the rest of the evening with Delilah reading across the firelit room, and thought about what it costs a person to carry something they do not know they are carrying. He thought about the way she had said her mother's name and then gone quiet. He thought about what the letter would do to her and whether it was his place to decide when she received it, and decided, after a long deliberation with himself, not to say anything until the morning. He made the wrong decision. He said nothing. What he did not know was that she had already registered the envelope's absence from the case. She had packed that case herself. She knew exactly what was in it and exactly where each item sat. She had noticed the envelope's position when she first went through the case in the cabin, and she had made a deliberate choice not to open it, which was a choice she had been making since she found the case among her father's effects the week after he died, which was a choice she had been making in various forms for most of her adult life. She did not say anything either. She went to sleep across the fire from the man who had the letter in his shirt pocket, and she let the question of it rest where it had rested for 23 years. The following morning, Will rode back to the main ranch for supplies and Hank's latest report, and returned in the late afternoon to find something he had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. Hank had ridden out to meet him on the main trail, which was not something Hank did without reason. "Sheriff Draper came by this morning," Hank said. "Real friendly. Asked how you were doing. Asked if you had company out at the place lately." Hank pushed his hat back. "Thing is, he asked about the company before I mentioned it. Said he'd heard you might have a guest out at the line shack. I told him I didn't know anything about any guest. He thanked me real polite and rode off north." Will listened to this with the external stillness that was his primary characteristic, and the internal process that was its constant companion, which was fast and thorough and not given to self-deception. Cole had known about the guest before Hank mentioned it. Cole had known. He thanked Hank and sent him back with a message to deliver in person to the sheriff's office in Moab, a friendly note in Will's handwriting mentioning that he planned to bring his visitor through town via the East Canyon Road on Wednesday morning early before the heat built. Would Cole be around? He would appreciate a word. If Gerald's men appeared on the East Road Wednesday morning, the question of Cole Draper would be answered. He told Delilah only that they might need to move sooner than planned. She read something in his face which she was becoming skilled at reading despite its economy of expression. "There's something else," she said. "There might be. I need 2 days to confirm it." "Will, 2 days. Then I will tell you everything I know. If I am wrong, I will have frightened you for nothing. If you would rather hear it now, I will tell you now." She studied him. "You're doing the thing where you decide what I should know. I'm asking you to give me 48 hours to verify a theory before it changes everything. That's different from deciding for you." A long pause. The fire between them. Outside the canyon wind. 48 hours, she said. In Denver, Gerald Jameson sat alone in his office after the building had emptied for the evening. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a small photograph. A formal portrait, a young woman in her early 20s, formal dark dress, hair arranged in the fashion of the late 1850s. A face that had been genuinely beautiful and had known it without using the knowledge carelessly, which was the particular quality he had found most impossible to forget in the 40 years since he had last seen it living. He looked at it for a long time without expression. "I tried to give you a way out," he said to the photograph, "before everything went wrong. Before your husband decided his money was more important than what you deserved." He put the photograph back, closed the drawer, picked up his pen and wrote a short note to be sent west by morning wire. "Confirm she is dead before the end of the week. Anyone with her as well, Wednesday morning." Will was on the north ridge above the East Canyon Road before dawn, his horse ground-tied in a draw 200 yards back, himself belly down on a flat rock with a clear view of the canyon mouth and the quarter-mile of open ground leading to it. He waited. At 7:45, 3 riders came out of the scrubland south of the road. They moved with the particular deliberate slowness of men taking up positions, not traveling. They spread across the canyon mouth at intervals and settled in and waited with the patience of men who had been told exactly when and where to be. They held their positions for 2 hours. When no one came through, they turned and rode back south. Cole Draper had sold them. Will rode back to the cabin and sat for a while on the step outside before he went in. He had been a Pinkerton detective for 11 years. He had trusted Cole Draper with things he had not trusted to anyone else in that time. He had told Cole about the cabin. He had told him once, years ago, in a letter he had written, and later wished he had not, because Will had been in a solitary year that had gotten darker than he usually let it get, and Cole had been the only person he was willing to reach toward. He sat on the step and breathed the canyon air, which smelled of juniper and sandstone and cold October, and nothing that had any opinion about betrayal one way or another. Then he went inside to tell Delilah what he knew. She found the letter herself. She had been waiting in the careful, patient way she had learned from years of watching children wait for things they were afraid to ask for directly, for Will to tell her about the envelope. She had watched him move through the cabin that morning with the particular quality of constraint that people carry when they know something and are deciding what to do with the knowing. She had seen it in her father's face often enough in the years after her mother died. The specific posture of a man tending a secret he has not yet decided whether is his to keep. When he went outside after breakfast to check on Ranger, she crossed to the document case on the table and opened it. The envelope was gone. She looked at Will's jacket on the hook by the door. He had not worn a different jacket since they arrived. She went to the jacket and checked the left breast pocket and found the envelope there, folded once along its length. She took it to the window that faced east and opened it in the morning light with her back to the room and read the physician's letter from beginning to end without stopping. She stood at that window for a long time afterward. The letter was dated 1860. Her mother had died in 1860. She had been 8 years old, and her father had told her that her mother had been taken by a sudden pneumonia, a bad one that came on fast the way they sometimes do, and there had been nothing to be done. He had told her this with the careful steadiness of a man who has decided on a story and will hold to it because the alternative is worse. She had believed him because she was 8 years old, and because she loved him, and because children believe the things they are told by the people they love. But something had persisted. Not a memory exactly, more like a residue. The particular way her mother had looked the last weeks before she died, which was not the way sick people looked, but the way cornered people looked. The door of her parents' bedroom that was closed more often than it had been before. The sound of her father's voice, very late, through the wall between their rooms, low and urgent in a way she had not understood at 8 and had not been able to stop carrying at 31. She had been afraid of marriage her whole adult life. She had understood it as a personal failing, something architectural in her own character, a deficiency of the trust that marriage required. She had told herself it was the result of watching her father grieve, of understanding from a young age that the depth of love was precisely proportional to the magnitude of its potential loss. She had constructed a reasonable explanation from available materials and had lived inside it for 23 years. Now she had a different explanation, and she was standing at the window holding it, and it was both worse and better than the one she had built. Worse because it was true. Better because it was not her fault, and was not her mother's weakness, and was not some inherited incapacity for happiness. It was something that had been done to them by a man who was still alive, and who had recently attempted to continue doing it. She set the letter on the table when Will came back inside. "You read this," she said. Not a question. "Yes. When?" "3 nights ago." "And you decided not to tell me." "I decided I didn't know whether you wanted to know." "That wasn't your decision to make. I know that now." "Did you know it 3 nights ago?" Silence. "That's what I thought." She sat down and looked at the letter on the table between them and did not speak for a full minute. He did not fill the silence, which was one of the things she was coming to understand about him. He knew when silence was the right response, and he was not afraid of it, which was rarer in a person than it should have been. Finally, she said, in a voice that was very quiet and very even, like someone speaking from the other side of something that has not yet finished breaking. She didn't die of pneumonia. No. Gerald drove her to it. That's what the letter says. Another silence. The fire. The canyon outside. I've been afraid of marriage my whole life, she said. I thought I was broken in some particular way. I thought I had missed something that other people had. Some capacity for trust. She picked up the letter and looked at it. Now I know where it came from. I absorbed it from her at 8 years old because children know more than we tell them. They feel the shape of things even when no one names the shape. Will said nothing. This was not a moment for him to fix, and he understood that. He let it be what it was. After a while, she said, I'm not angry at you for reading it. You have the right to be. I know. I'm choosing not to spend it that way. She set the letter down. But I need you to understand something. You keep making decisions about what I should know and when I should know it. You did it with the letter, and I believe you did it out of something that was not unkind. But I've spent my entire life in the company of men who decided what I was ready for and what I wasn't. My father, my uncle, the attorneys, every man in every room I've ever sat in. I don't need one more. Will looked at her steadily. Understood, he said. Do you? Yes, and I will do better. She held his gaze for a moment, deciding whether she believed him. She decided she did, partly because of the way he said it, which was without the specific cadence of a man managing her, and partly because of the notebook under the floor, and what the existence of that notebook told her about a man who held himself accountable. Good, she said. Now tell me what else you know that you haven't told me yet. He told her about Cole. He laid it out, the way he laid everything out, plainly and in sequence, without the embellishments or cushioning that people used when they were trying to make difficult information easier to receive. Cole Draper. 9 years as sheriff of Moab County. A man Will had trusted during the Pinkerton years with the kind of trust that two men develop when they have worked dangerous ground together long enough that hiding things from each other becomes impractical. The line shack, which Will had mentioned in a letter. The test with the East Road. The 3 riders at 7:45. Delilah processed it with the stillness she brought to hard things. Who else knows about this cabin, she said. Cole, and nobody else living. Then we're out of time. Yes. Do you know why he's doing it? Not yet. But a man like Cole doesn't sell out a friend without reason. He has something on him. Has to. She looked at the fire. My uncle is very good at finding reasons. I know. There was a sound outside, the movement of a horse somewhere in the dark of the canyon, and Will was on his feet and at the door with his rifle before Delilah had fully processed the sound. He stood at the open door and listened for 30 seconds, and then the sound resolved into nothing significant. A deer or a coyote working along the base of the east wall, and he lowered the rifle and came back in. She watched this without comment. The speed of it, the way his body had moved before his mind had time to frame the response. It was not courage exactly, or not only courage. It was something older and more specific, a particular relationship between threat and response that had been built over years of work in conditions where the cost of a slow reaction was permanent. Tell me about before, she said. Before Utah. He sat back down. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, 11 years with Pinkerton. Before that, a year working cattle drives out of Kansas. Before that, the war, same as most men my age. What branch? Army of the Tennessee, 4th Corps. She nodded. She had taught the children of veterans, and she understood without needing it explained what those years did to the people who survived them. What the specific combination of absolute authority and absolute helplessness did to a young man's relationship with institutions and rules, and the people charged with enforcing them. And the Pinkerton work, she said. Varied. Started doing fugitive recovery, which is what most young men started with because it required speed and it didn't require subtlety. Moved to investigative work, corporate mostly toward the end, protecting assets, which is its own kind of education in what men will do when money is involved. Is that why you know how Gerald operates? Partly. I've met 100 Geralds, different names, different industries, same architecture. They surround themselves with layers. Nobody does anything directly. The man at the center always has clean hands and a good attorney. She was quiet for a moment. You said you had a personal stake in this. I said I'd tell you when I'd confirmed the coal situation. You've confirmed it. He looked at the fire. In 1879, Pinkerton put me on a protection detail for a man named Arthur Holt, business partner of your uncle's in Cheyenne. 3 weeks after I rotated off the assignment, Holt died in what the official report called an accident. I pushed to reopen it. My supervisor told me to close it and move on. I refused to sign the closure report. 2 months later, I was terminated for insubordination. He paused. Your uncle had me fired. I couldn't prove it then, but the pattern was identical. Delilah was very still. You've been carrying a personal grievance against Gerald this whole time. Yes, you should know that before we go any further. Why? Because it means my judgment about this situation may not be entirely objective. You should weigh that. She looked at him with an expression he could not fully read. Or, she said slowly, it means you understand exactly what he is and what he's capable of, and your judgment is more reliable, not less. He considered that. That's one reading of it. It's the accurate one. She leaned back. The question is what we do now, with Cole watching and 2 of my uncle's men in the territory, and God knows who else. There's a way out, Will said. But it has a cost. Tell me. He told her about Castle Ford. He did not been adequately investigated, and the not been adequately investigated. The man's widow still living in Castle Ford, and running the only boarding house on the route they would need to travel to reach the rail junction at Crescent Junction. The route to Crescent Junction ran directly through Castle Ford. There was no other way. She listened to the surface account, and then she looked at him and said, "And when we get there, you're going to tell her the truth." He had not said anything about the truth. She deserves to hear it from the man who signed the paper, Delilah said. I don't know the details, and I don't need them right now, but I know the look on your face when you talk about it, and I know you have been running from it for a long time, and I know that you read my letter and sat on it for 3 days, and that gives me something to say about what you owe the people that your choices damaged. Will was quiet for a long moment. You're right, he said, for the first time. I know. She stood up. Tell me what to pack. In Denver, Gerald Jameson received a wire from his man in the Utah territory. The wire said, East Road clear, no contact, target unlocated. Gerald read it at his desk and set it down and looked at the photograph he had taken from the drawer an hour ago and set on the desktop, which he did sometimes in the evenings when the building was empty. He had loved Eleanor Jameson with a specific and absolute completeness that he had never been able to reproduce with any other person or any other feeling in his life. And she had been given to his brother, because his brother had $30,000 and Gerald at 25 had had nothing, and that equation had ruined the mathematics of everything that came after it. He was not a man who experienced his own cruelty as cruelty. He experienced it as the logical extension of a debt that had never been paid. He reached for his pen. They left the cabin 2 hours before dawn. Hank had been paid a full month in advance and sent to his sister's place in Price with instructions to stay there and speak to no one about Will's location or activities, instructions Hank accepted with the incurious reliability that made him the best ranch hand Will had ever employed. The horses were loaded light. Delilah had changed into the riding clothes Will had brought back from town on his last supply run, practical dark cotton that caught no light, and she had pinned her hair up under a hat in a way that, in the canyon darkness, might pass for a young man if you were not looking closely. She had asked Will, before they mounted, about Gerald's men, about the man on the roof of the last car with the field glass. "Will they know I'm alive?" "He knows. He sent men to confirm, and they found nothing. That's not the same as knowing you're dead. So he'll keep looking. He won't stop until he has confirmation one way or the other." She nodded. She mounted without assistance, which he had noticed she always did, and they rode out of the canyon in the dark with the stars overhead and no lamp. The canyon country at night was something that people who had never been in it could not fully imagine. The silence was not the silence of absence, but the silence of the presence of very old things. Rock formations that had stood for millions of years, containing the absence of any concern about human difficulty within their mass. The cold came down from the canyon walls as they moved through, and the horses' breath made small clouds, and the sound of their hooves on the canyon floor was the loudest thing in the world. They did not talk much. The silence between them had changed over the days in the cabin. It was no longer the silence of two people measuring each other. It was the silence of two people who had said enough of the hard things that quiet no longer felt like concealment. Somewhere around the second hour, Delilah said, "What was she like, the wife of the man with the lamp?" Will was quiet for a moment. "I never met her. But you know her name? It's in the notebook." "Yes." A pause. "Did you ever think about going to her? Telling her?" "Thought about it. Decided I didn't have the right to put my need to confess ahead of her need to not have it reopened. That might have been the right decision, or it might have been another way of protecting yourself. I've thought about both possibilities. Which one do you believe? Some days one, some days the other." She turned this over for a while as they rode. "I think," she said finally, "that the fact that you've never been able to decide is probably the honest answer. Most men would have picked one and stopped questioning it." He looked at her in the dark. "That sounds like something Marcus Aurelius would say if he were more direct about it." She made a sound that was the beginning of a laugh. "He wasn't very direct. No. But he was honest about the difficulty of it, which amounts to the same thing." They reached Castle Ford 2 days after leaving the cabin, following canyon trails that Will knew from years of grazing the far end of his property. Paths that did not appear on any official survey and were not used by anyone with a reason to be somewhere in particular. The second night they camped in an arroyo under a rock overhang that kept the wind off and ate dried beef and hardtack and the last of the coffee from Will's supply. And Delilah sat across the small fire from him and said, "Tell me about the case, the whole of it." He told her. He had been assigned the case by a supervisor named Aldrich, who had been with Pinkerton since the war, and had developed over that time the particular perspective of a man who had seen enough of the institutional machinery of justice to have stopped believing in the machinery while retaining a professional commitment to the motions of it. Thomas Bishop had been accused of conspiracy to defraud. The evidence as presented was thin, circumstantial, built on the testimony of two men whose own dealings did not bear examination. But Aldrich had wanted the case closed before the end of the quarter and had pressured Will to sign the investigative summary that supported the prosecution's version. Will had signed it. He had pushed back, had raised the specific evidentiary issues with Aldrich twice, had asked for another 2 weeks to follow certain threads. Aldrich had told him that the threads led nowhere useful, and that the case was closed, and that Will's job was to document the investigation that had been conducted, not to conduct a different one. Will had signed. Thomas Bishop had hanged on a March morning in 1878, and Will had not been in Castle Ford for the hanging, and had received the news by post a week later and had not done anything with it. He had been terminated from Pinkerton 4 months later, officially for the insubordination regarding Arthur Holt, and he had left his apartment in Denver and spent 3 months working a cattle drive into New Mexico, and had then come to Utah and built a ranch and a cabin, and a silence around himself that he had maintained for 6 years with considerable effort. Delilah listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at the fire. And Ruth Bishop, the widow, yes. Does she know about your part in it? I don't know. She may know I was one of the Pinkerton men on the case. Whether she knows I was the one who signed the summary, I don't know. But you know. Yes. She looked at him across the fire. Then you know what you have to tell her when we get there. I do. And you'll tell her? Yes. She held his gaze. I told you my mother's name, and then I stopped, back at the cabin. You asked what I was carrying, and I told you her name, and then I stopped. I remember. I've been carrying the shape of what happened to her for 23 years without the actual knowledge of it. Just the residue, the feeling, the fear I couldn't explain. She looked down at her hands. Now I have the knowledge, and I find that it's easier and harder at the same time. Easier because it has a shape I can see and think about. Harder because now I know what it actually was, and I understand what it cost her and what it cost me. She paused. I don't think I'm going to be able to hate my uncle in the way I thought I was going to hate him, she said. I thought what I felt was hatred. But it's more like grief, which is almost worse. Grief and hatred can look like each other for a long time, Will said. Have you confused them? Once or twice? She looked at him. About? About what Pinkerton turned out to be. About the gap between what I thought the institution was and what I eventually understood it to be. She nodded slowly. And now? Now I know what it was. I did good work in it, and I did compromised work in it. And both of those things are true simultaneously, which is uncomfortable but accurate. He paused. Most things that are accurate are uncomfortable. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, That's the most honest thing I've heard anyone say in a long time. They reached Castle Ford the following afternoon. It was a small town that had never achieved the ambitions its founders had probably harbored, a collection of buildings along a single main street that had the look of something that had decided it was finished growing and had settled into what it was going to be. A saloon, a general store, a church that appeared to be maintained more from habit than conviction. And at the far end of the street, a two-story building with a hand-painted sign that had once read Bishop's Rest. And now, the paint having faded to near illegibility, read simply, Bishop. Ruth Bishop was sweeping the porch when they rode up. She was a tall woman carrying her 55 years in a way that suggested they had been fully lived, with gray coming through the dark of her hair and hands that showed the work of years running a boarding house alone. She looked up at the sound of their horses, and then she looked at Will, and she stopped sweeping. She did not reach for anything. She did not raise her voice. She stood with the broom handle held still against the boards and looked at him with the expression of someone who has thought about a specific moment so many times that its arrival in reality is almost disorienting. Like a place you have visited only in imagination suddenly becoming a place you are standing. I wondered if you'd come back someday, she said. I almost didn't, Will said. I know. That's why I'm surprised you're here. She fed them before she allowed the conversation. This was not hospitality in the social sense, but in the deeper, practical sense. The understanding that difficult things require people who are fed and warm and have been given a moment's grace before they are asked to carry weight. She put plates in front of them in the kitchen and sat across the table herself with coffee and watched them eat without conversation. And it was not uncomfortable, which itself said something about the kind of person she was. Delilah, without being asked, rose when the plates were empty and took them to the basin and began washing them. Ruth watched this too and said nothing, but her expression shifted slightly in a way that Will registered. Then Delilah dried her hands and said, I'll be outside, and went out, and left them. Will and Ruth sat across from each other in the kitchen with the coffee going cold between them and the sound of the early evening wind off the canyon country moving against the windows. He did not start with an apology. An apology was about his need to be released from what he had done, and he had no right to put his need in front of her in the guise of something being offered to her. He started with facts. What he had known at the time the investigation was conducted, what he had not known, what he had been told by Aldrich, and what he had questioned, and what he had not questioned enough. What he had signed, and what the signing had represented in the context of what he had verified and had not verified. He told it straight through without stopping, and she listened to all of it without interrupting. And when he finished, she looked at him for a long moment with dark, steady eyes. "Thomas wasn't innocent of everything," she said. "I found out things after he died that I didn't know while he was living. He'd gotten himself into a situation with men he didn't understand well enough to be careful around. He was trying to get us out from under a debt, and he went looking for quick money and found something faster than it was safe. I know. But he didn't deserve to hang for it. And my boy grew up without his father because a Pinkerton man needed to close his report before Christmas." "Yes. Are you here to ask for forgiveness?" "No, ma'am. I don't have the right to ask for that." She looked at him. "Good. Because I'm not ready to give it." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "But I'll tell you something. There's a difference between a man who did wrong because he was lazy and didn't care, and a man who did wrong because he was under pressure and didn't push hard enough against people he should have pushed harder against. I know which one you are. I've had 6 years to work that out. I'm not sure the distinction matters much to your son." "It doesn't, but it matters to me." She stood and picked up the cups. "You can have the back room for the night, both of you. I won't ask questions about the woman." Will stood. He looked at the window over the basin that faced the street, and then he said, "Her name is Delilah Jameson. Her uncle is Gerald Jameson." Ruth went very still. "I know that name. I thought you might." She turned around slowly and looked at him with an expression that had changed, the careful steadiness of it giving way to something underneath that had been held in a closed room for a long time. "The man who put Thomas in Gerald Jameson's path, the one who brought Thomas the job that got him tangled up with those men in the first place. That came from Gerald's organization. Gerald was running money he didn't want traced through small operations like the one Thomas got pulled into. When Thomas got nervous and started talking about going to the county attorney, Gerald's people made sure Thomas was the one who went down for it instead." Her hands were level, but her voice was not entirely. "I've never been able to prove it. I never had access to the kind of evidence that would have meant anything." Will said, "She has the evidence." Ruth looked toward the back of the building where Delilah had gone. A long silence. "Then God help her get where she's going," Ruth said. That night, Will and Delilah sat on the back step of the boarding house in the dark with the canyon wind moving around them and the stars overhead in the particular abundance that was only visible from high desert country, away from any town large enough to have gas lamps. "How do you feel?" she said. He thought about it honestly, which was the only way she had ever heard him think about anything. "Like I've been carrying a stone for 6 years, and someone finally told me I can set it down. But my arms don't remember how to not hold it." She was quiet for a moment. "That's the most words you've used at once since I met you," she said. "Don't get used to it." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. Not a declaration. Just the particular human contact that says, "I see you and I am still here," which is sometimes the most important thing one person can say to another, without saying anything at all. He did not move away. They were still sitting on the step when they heard hoofbeats coming in from the north, and Will was on his feet with his rifle before the rider cleared the fence line of the boarding house yard. The rider pulled up short at the sight of the rifle and said, "Easy, Will. It's me." The voice was old and specific, and belonging to a man named Carlos, who was supposed to be 60 miles east, managing the main ranch. Carlos dismounted slowly, with the careful movements of a man in his late 60s who has been in the saddle for 2 days without adequate rest. And when he got close enough to the lantern light from the boarding house window, Will could see the dried cut above his eyebrow and the particular tightness around his eyes that meant he had been frightened recently and had not yet finished being frightened. "They came to the ranch," Carlos said. 4 of them. came in fast and hard. I got out the back before they saw me. He reached into his coat. But I found this in the saddlebag of the lead horse. One of them left it when they changed mounts at your barn. He held out a folded paper. Will took it, opened it in the lantern light. It was a list of names. Handwritten, 9 names in total, 3 of them crossed through with a single horizontal line. People already dealt with, already gone. The last name, not crossed out, was his own, Will Zander. Not Delilah's name. His. He stood in the lantern light and read his own name on a list of people Gerald Jameson wanted dead and understood what it meant, which was that this had never been primarily about Delilah. She was secondary. She was the document carrier, the evidence holder, the heir who needed to be removed. But Will Zander was the primary target because Will Zander was the only living man who could connect Gerald Jameson to the cover-up of Arthur Holt's death in 1879, which was the thread that, if pulled, would unravel the entire architecture of what Gerald had built. Gerald had not sent men to confirm Delilah's death. He had sent men to find Will Zander. Will folded the list and put it in his pocket and looked at the canyon walls in the dark and thought about the morning and what it would require. He told Delilah in the morning, at the kitchen table before Ruth was up, while the light outside was the particular gray of early dawn that has not yet decided what kind of day it wants to be. He put the list on the table between them and let her read it without commentary. She read it twice, the way she read everything important. Then she said, "He was never coming for me first. No. The documents were always secondary. You were always the primary target." That's what the list says. She looked at it again. He fired you from Pinkerton in 1879 because you wouldn't close the Holt investigation. He's been waiting 6 years for a reason to finish what he started. Or a situation where finishing it could look like something else. Like cleaning up after a problem with his niece. Yes. She set the list down. She was quiet for a moment with the particular stillness that he had come to understand was not passivity, but computation, the working of a fast and precise mind through the available information. You knew this was a possibility when you took me in. I knew Gerald's history. I didn't know about the list. But you knew what kind of man he was and what kind of man you were to him. He said nothing. You rode out there anyway, she said. Knowing. I saw you fall off a train. Will, he looked at her. You knew, and you rode out anyway. A man who'd done what I'd done to Thomas Bishop's family doesn't get to look the other way twice. She held his gaze. Then she said, "All right. What do we do now?" He had spent the night working it out in the back room while Carlos slept on a pallet on the floor and Delilah slept in the other bunk. He had been through the options with the systematic thoroughness that was his primary professional skill, and had arrived at what was the only viable route with the clear-eyed recognition that viable was doing a significant amount of work in that sentence. The main routes east were closed. Moab was Cole Draper's territory, and Cole had demonstrated where his allegiance currently sat. The stage roads were watched. Going back to the cabin was not an option with 4 of Gerald's men knowing the location of the ranch. Crescent Junction was the only option. A small rail junction 40 miles north through canyon breaks, used primarily for livestock transfer, serviced by the Denver and Rio Grande Western once a week. The next eastbound train departed in 36 hours. The trail to Crescent Junction was rough, but known to Will and unknown to anyone Gerald had likely sent into the territory. He explained this to Delilah. She said, "What's the catch?" "Cole Draper." She waited. "Cole knows I know about him now. When he doesn't hear from Gerald's men that we came through on the East Road, he'll understand that the test was a test and that he failed it. He'll know we're moving. He knows this country. Will he come after us himself, or will he tell Gerald's men? I don't know yet." She thought about this. If he tells Gerald's men, we have 4 men from the ranch, plus however many Gerald has watching the rail stations in the territory. If he comes himself, then we have 1 man who knows me and knows how I think, which is in some ways more dangerous and in some ways less. Because a man who knows you won't run from a conversation. Yes. She looked at the window and the gray light coming through it. And if he does come, what do you think he'll do? I think, Will said carefully, that Cole Draper is a man who made a bad decision at 23 years old in a war and has been paying for it quietly ever since, and that Gerald found the thread of it and has been using it to turn a decent man into something that decent man did not intend to become. And I think there is still a decision available to Cole that he has not yet made. You think he'll choose right? I think he might, if given the chance. Delilah was quiet for a moment. That's a considerable amount of trust to extend to a man who sold you to Gerald's hired guns. It's a considerable amount of trust, yes. She looked at him. You're willing to stake our lives on that. I'm willing to stake mine. Yours is your decision. She was quiet for a long moment. All right, she said finally. But if you're wrong about him, I want to be standing next to you when you find out, not somewhere safe where you've stashed me while you handle it. He looked at her. I know, he said. I know that now. Carlos ate breakfast with them, and then Will had a private conversation with the older man in the barn while Delilah talked with Ruth in the kitchen. He explained the situation as clearly as he could without making it sound as bad as it was, which was a courtesy to Carlos, and did not in fact deceive Carlos, who had been reading situations clearly for 67 years, and was not about to stop now. Carlos said he would stay in Castleford with Ruth, which was his decision to make, and which Will did not argue with because Carlos was correct that he would slow them down on the canyon trail, and because Ruth Bishop was a woman alone in a town where, if Gerald's men came through looking for information, she might need someone present who understood the shape of the threat. Will gave Carlos his rifle and half his ammunition, and his honest thanks, and Carlos accepted all 3 with the dignity of a man who understood what he was being asked to do and intended to do it without ceremony. They saddled up in the early afternoon. Ruth Bishop came to the yard to see them off. She shook Delilah's hand first and held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires, looking at her with the particular expression of a woman who has seen a great deal of what people can do to each other and has come to hold the ones who survive it in a specific kind of regard. Then she looked at Will. Oh. The stone doesn't weigh the same as it did when you rode in, she said. No, he agreed. It won't get lighter on its own. I know. But lighter's not the same as gone. Lighter's enough to work with. He thought about that. Yes, he said. I believe it is. They rode north. The canyon breaks between Castle Ford and Crescent Junction were not on any survey map that Will was aware of, which was one of the things that made them useful and one of the things that made them dangerous. The trail ran along the bottoms of 2 successive canyons, and then climbed over a sandstone ridge that gave out onto the high desert plateau north of the canyon country. And the going was slow where it was steep, and monotonous where it was flat, and Will rode in front and read the ground, and Delilah rode behind, and matched his pace, and neither of them spent much time in silence that felt anything other than productive. At one point, somewhere in the second canyon, she said, "The notebook." He looked back. "When this is over," she said, "I want to read it." He turned back to the trail. "Why?" "Because you read my letter. Because what's in that notebook is the whole of what you've been carrying alone. And I don't think a person should carry something like that with no one else who knows the weight of it." He was quiet for a long while. "It's not a comfortable thing to read. I'm not asking you to make it comfortable. I'm asking you to let me know the truth of who you are, all of it." Another long silence. The canyon walls on either side. The sound of hooves on stone. "All right," he said. She said nothing more. They rode. They came out onto the plateau in the late afternoon, and the light was the particular sideways gold of the last hour before sunset, and it hit the red rock of the canyon country behind them and turned it the color of something burning, and Delilah pulled up briefly to look at it, and Will pulled up beside her, and they both looked south at the burning country they had come through. And there was a long moment that was not quite speech and not quite silence, and was something that exists between those two things when two people have been through enough together that the ordinary categories stop being sufficient. Then they rode on toward Crescent Junction, and the sun went down behind the western mountains, and the night came down around them cold and clear and full of stars. Crescent Junction in the late morning of an October Tuesday was exactly the kind of place that existed because a railroad needed somewhere to put water and the surrounding country needed somewhere to put livestock waiting for transport. And these two necessities had generated, over the course of the years since the track came through, a minimal collection of human habitation that served both purposes without aspiring to anything additional. A water tower, a depot that was primarily a waiting room and a telegraph station, a livestock pen that smelled of what livestock pens smell of, a saloon that also handled the mail and sold tobacco and rope and occasionally foodstuffs when the main trading post in the next county was too far to ride for something specific. The eastbound train came through at 2 in the afternoon 3 days a week in the summer and once a week in the fall and winter when the cattle shipment slowed down. It was 8 in the morning. Will bought 2 tickets under false names from the depot agent, a young man with ink on his fingers who was more interested in the manifest for a livestock shipment going west than in the identities of passengers heading east, and they settled in to wait in an empty equipment shed at the far end of the loading yard, which smelled of machine grease and old hay and the accumulated history of things stored and forgotten. Delilah slept. She went out like a lamp, sitting against the wall with her back straight and her hat pulled down over her eyes, the particular quality of unconsciousness that belongs to people who have been running on the shallow end of their reserves for long enough that the body seizes the first opportunity without consultation. Will watched the approaches and let her sleep, and did not find it difficult to let her sleep, which was itself a thing he noticed. He had never been good at letting people rest when there was work to be done. It was one of the Pinkerton habits he had identified, and had been less successful at eliminating than some of the others, the sense that rest was a luxury that circumstances rarely justified. Delilah, sleeping against the wall of the equipment shed with complete uncalculated trust in his watchfulness, was not something that reminded him of a liability or a vulnerability. It was something that felt unexpectedly like the specific weight of something that mattered. He sat with that for a while. At 11 o'clock, he heard a single horse coming in from the south road at a pace that was unhurried and alone, and he recognized the horse by its gait before he recognized the rider, which was the way it worked when you had spent time around a man's horses. Cole Draper tied up at the saloon and went inside. 5 minutes later, he came back out and walked directly toward the equipment shed without looking anywhere else, which meant he had asked about them and received information, which meant the depot agent or the saloon keeper or someone else in Crescent Junction had seen them come in and noted it and said so when asked, which was what happened in small towns where the arrival of strangers was itself an event. Cole stopped 20 feet from the shed door. "Will," he said, "I know you're in there. Come out and talk to me. I rode a long way for a conversation." Delilah's eyes were open when Will looked back at her. She had come awake at the sound of hoofbeats and had been listening since. She gave him a short nod. "I'm here. I'm ready." He stepped out of the shed with his rifle held down at his side. The morning sun was behind him, and in Cole's eyes, which was not accidental. They looked at each other across 20 feet of junction dust for a moment that had the particular quality of time that happens when two people who have known each other well arrive at a point where what they knew has been complicated beyond easy recovery. Cole looked older than the last time Will had seen him. Not physically especially, though there was that. He looked older, in the way that men look old when they have been carrying something heavier than they told anyone about, and the carrying has finally started to show. "You set me up with the East Road," Cole said. "I needed to know." "I know you did." Cole's jaw tightened. I want you to understand something about the East Road. I sent Gerald's men to the East Road because I told them that was where you'd be. What I did not tell you, because I was still trying to manage two things at once instead of choosing one, was that I told them to be at the East Road on Wednesday because I knew you were too smart to use the East Road on Wednesday. You'd see it as the obvious route and avoid it. Will looked at him steadily. You're saying you deliberately sent them wrong. I'm saying I needed Gerald to believe I was still useful to him while I worked out what I was going to do. A pause, which I will acknowledge is not the same as being straightforwardly on your side. No, it is not. Cole looked at the ground. Gerald Jameson has been holding something over me for 11 years. Something from the war. A supply depot in Tennessee in '64. A decision I made when I was 23 and scared and it was cold, and the men under me were hungry, and I convinced myself that the army had more than it needed, and the civilians in the area had nothing. He paused. The family that owned the depot lost everything. Gerald found the record of it. He's been holding it ever since. Will said nothing. I've been telling myself, Cole said, that I was managing it, keeping the damage contained, making sure nobody really got hurt. He looked up. The woman on that train was supposed to be an accident. When I heard she survived, I made myself believe that was Gerald's problem to resolve, not mine. That as long as I stayed useful to him, I wasn't responsible for what he did with the information I provided. And that story ran out of road about halfway here. He looked at the shed. There are 4 men from Gerald's main crew 2 hours south of here, the ones he sends when everything else has failed. They know you're in this county and they'll work toward this junction. Will was still. How long? 2 hours. Maybe less if they picked up your trail coming in. Delilah had come to the door of the shed. Cole looked at her. Miss Jameson, he said, I am genuinely sorry for what my actions contributed to. She looked at him with the direct assessment she brought to everything. How sorry? Cole was quiet for a moment. Sorry enough to ride south and give those 4 men a bad direction. Buy you time to get on that train. And then? And then I deal with the consequences of that on my end. She studied him. You could come with us, testify. The prosecutor's office would deal on the charges. Maybe after, Cole said. I've got some business to finish out here first. There are people in this county who deserve better than what I've been doing, and I'd like a chance to do better before I go to Denver and answer for the rest of it. Will and Cole looked at each other across the dust in the 10 years and what had been lost of them and what had not. I'll write to you, Will said, when this is settled. You don't have to. No. Cole put his hat on. He looked at Delilah one more time. Your father was a better man than his brother, for what it's worth. He mounted and rode south. Inside the equipment shed, Will and Delilah stood in the particular silence of a moment that has just settled from something turbulent into something still. You were right about him, she said. Partly right. You were right that there was still a choice available. And he made it. Late, Will said. He made it late. Late is what it is. It's still a choice. He looked at her. He had been looking at her, he realized, with an increasingly specific attention for the past 10 days, and had been cataloging the results of that attention without quite admitting to himself what the catalog was for. He had been cataloging the way she read a room before she said anything in it, the way she had read the notebook under the floor and set it back without violation, the way she had told him what he owed Ruth Bishop without asking permission to tell him, the way she slept with her back straight even in exhaustion, the way she had taken the truth about her mother and carried it without collapsing under it. He had been building a case in the particular way of a man trained to build cases, and the case had been arriving at a conclusion he had not permitted himself to state directly. He stated it now, to himself, standing in an equipment shed in Crescent Junction with the train whistle sounding its first approach in the distance and 4 of Gerald Jameson's men 2 hours south. He was in love with this woman, completely and without the usual carefully maintained reservations. The way he had once promised himself he would never allow again, having understood from the 1877 farmhouse that the cost of caring was proportional to the depth of the caring, and had therefore closed the possibility of depth in the years since. The armor had come off piece by piece without his permission, or perhaps with permissions he had been granting without acknowledging he was granting them. And now it was gone, and he was standing in the full exposure of it. And what he felt most unexpectedly was not fear. What he felt most unexpectedly was relief. She was watching him with the expression of someone who has been watching a complicated process arrive at a conclusion and is waiting with real patience for the conclusion to be stated. "When this is done," he said. "When this is done," she agreed. Not a full sentence. Both of them understood it completely. The train whistled again, closer now. They gathered what they carried and moved toward the depot. Before they reached it, Delilah stopped at the telegraph station. The operator was young and distracted by the incoming train manifest. She wrote out a message in what looked to Will like ordinary English, but was arranged in a specific sequence that his investigator's eye recognized as constructed, and she addressed it to a firm in Denver he had not heard of. The message said, "Margaret is coming home. Please have the house ready." "Your father," Will said. He was afraid of Gerald for 20 years. He prepared. She handed the message to the operator. "Once this goes, the firm in Denver will contact a prosecutor's office Gerald doesn't know about. Everything I have will be presented with or without me." She looked at Will. "I should have done this days ago. I was waiting until I was sure we'd make the train. I didn't want to light the fire until I knew we were already moving." The train pulled into the station in a great release of steam and noise and the smell of coal smoke and hot metal, and they joined the thin stream of passengers boarding, and Will Zander did not look back at the town of Crescent Junction as the train pulled out, which was something he noticed. He was usually a man who looked back. The train moved east through the high Utah desert and then into the edge of the Colorado Plateau country, and the land outside the windows changed from red sandstone canyon to the softer browns and greens of the eastern slope, and the motion of it after days of horseback and canyon trails had a quality that was almost like rest, almost like the pause between one kind of difficulty and whatever came next. They sat in the second car among ranching families and commercial travelers, and a drummer with a case of sample goods who was asleep against his valise before the train cleared the junction. Will watched the car, watched the people in it with the practiced inattention of someone trained to see without appearing to see. Nobody had followed them onto the train from the platform. Nobody in the car was showing the particular quality of awareness that Gerald's men had consistently displayed, the watchful stillness of people who are tracking rather than traveling. At 2:40, Delilah looked through the glass partition toward the dining car and went very still. Will followed her gaze. At a table near the window of the dining car, Elias Vance was sitting across from a man whose profile Will did not recognize, but whose posture Delilah apparently did, because she had turned back before Will fully registered the scene, and her face had the particular controlled expression of a person absorbing a blow and not intending to show it. "Tell me," Will said. "Elias Vance," she said quietly. "He's been my father's attorney for 18 years. He set up my father's estate. He handled the probate. He knew what was in the document case because my father told him." She paused. "He knew which train I booked because I told him. I called on him at his office the morning I left Denver. I told him I was going east to my aunt's and asked him to manage the estate correspondence until I was settled." Will said nothing. "He's sitting in the dining car with one of Gerald's men, the one who supervised the team on the train from Denver. I know his face." Will looked again. Two men eating together with the ease of men who had shared meals before. Not the stiff formality of a professional consultation. Something older and more comfortable than that. "He gave Gerald everything," Will said. "Every time I thought I was ahead of my uncle, I was planning inside a room Elias had the key to." She sat with this for 30 seconds, which was less time than most people would have needed. Then she stood up. I'm going to talk to him. Delilah. I know Elias Vance. I know what he values, and I know what he fears, and I know the specific way his mind constructs an exit from a situation he can no longer manage. She straightened her jacket. You stay at the door, hand on your gun. Don't come in unless I ask you to. You're sure? He betrayed me. My father trusted this man for 18 years, and he sold that trust to a man who tried to have me killed. I'm the one who has something to say to him. Will looked at her. The training said to evaluate the tactical situation, to assess the risk profile, to make the calculation about whether the tactical advantage of surprise outweighed the risk of engaging a hostile party in a confined space with multiple civilians present. The training was not what answered. I'll be at the door, he said. She walked into the dining car alone. She crossed to Vance's table and sat down in the empty chair without invitation or preliminary. The man across from Vance, Gerald's man, started to rise. Delilah looked at him with an expression that had no warmth in it and considerable ice beneath. Sit down, she said, quietly enough that it did not carry beyond the immediate table. This is a conversation between me and Mr. Vance. If you make it anything else, the next words out of my mouth will be loud enough for every person in this car to hear the name Gerald Jameson. And I will explain in considerable detail what that name means in the context of this train. He sat. Vance had gone the color of old paper. He had the look of a man who has been building a story about himself for a long time and has just seen the foundation of it exposed. Delilah, he said. I can explain. You can't, she said. But you can listen. She leaned forward slightly, voice level and even, the voice she had used with frightened children in Denver schools when she needed them to hear her clearly and not be additionally frightened by how she was speaking. I sent a telegraph from Crescent Junction before I boarded this train. It went to Carson and Pryor in Denver, who you don't know about because my father set them up outside the normal family legal structure specifically because he was afraid of my uncle's reach. By the time this train arrives in Denver, Carson and Pryor will have been in communication with the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for several hours. Everything I have is documented. The financial records, the correspondence, the physician's letter. It will be presented with or without my personal presence. Vance said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. Here is what happens next, Delilah said. At the next station stop, you get off this train. You go back to Denver under your own power. You present yourself voluntarily to the prosecutor's office within 24 hours and give them a complete and accurate accounting of your arrangement with Gerald Jameson. The duration of it, the nature of it, the compensation you received, the specific information you provided. And if I do that, then I don't pursue disbarment proceedings through the state bar, and I don't give your name to the newspapers. He looked at her. You're bluffing. My father taught me not to bluff with things I can't afford to lose. She held his gaze without wavering. Think carefully about what you know of me, Elias. Think about 18 years of watching me grow up. Then tell me whether bluffing is something you believe I'm doing. A long silence. The sound of the wheels against the rails. The movement of the car. You have one option that preserves anything of your life, she said. I'd encourage you to take it. She stood. She walked back to the door of the dining car where Will was standing with his hand at his side, and she walked past him into the corridor between cars, and he followed her and pulled the door closed behind them. Done, he said. Done. They stood in the corridor between cars with the wind coming through the gap at the bottom and the sound of the train enormous around them, and his hand found hers briefly in the narrow space. Not a declaration and not a gesture of comfort, but the specific contact that says, I was there and I saw it, and what I saw was something. She held his hand for a moment and then let it go. At the next station stop, Elias Vance disembarked from the train alone. He did not look back at the train as it pulled out, which Will noted. And he did not look like a man who had made a successful escape. He looked like a man who had been handed the last option available to him and understood what taking it meant. The train moved east into the Colorado evening. The train arrived at Denver's Union Depot at 6 in the morning, with the city still in the gray quiet before the working day began. The mountains to the west were visible against the lighter gray of the sky, enormous and patient and indifferent to trains and depositions, and the weight of what people carried into and out of cities. A young attorney named Fletcher was waiting on the platform. He was perhaps 26 years old, and had the specific vibrating energy of a man who has been given important work for the first time and is aware of both the importance and his own uncertainty about it, and has decided to manage the uncertainty through preparation and early arrival. He had clearly been awake for most of the previous night. He took the document case from Delilah with both hands, which Will found symbolically appropriate. He confirmed that the telegraph from Crescent Junction had been received. He confirmed that Carson and Pryor had been in communication with the Territorial Prosecutor's Office since the previous evening. He confirmed that 2 deputy U.S. Marshals and a detective from the Denver County Sheriff's Office were currently positioned outside the home of Gerald Jameson on Champa Street. Will said, "Gerald Jameson will be at his home until 8 o'clock. He does not go to his office before 8. Fletcher looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I was a Pinkerton detective for 11 years. I know how men like Gerald Jameson organize their mornings." Fletcher accepted this and went back to being vibratingly prepared. Gerald Jameson was taken at his home at 7:40 in the morning while he was at breakfast. He was, by the subsequent account of the deputies involved, calm. Not the calm of a man who was unaware of what was happening, but the calm of a man who had understood that something like this was a possible outcome, and had reached the end of his ability to prevent it, and had arrived, in the way that certain kinds of men do, at a kind of terrible equanimity about it. He was committed to the Denver County Jail pending arraignment. The charge sheet included embezzlement from the Jameson Bank and Trust over a period of 7 years, conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, and several related counts that the prosecutor's office had been building toward for months with the assistance of former business associates who had decided, in light of the evidence now available, that their earlier silence was no longer in their interest. The prosecutor, a steady man named Aldrich, who was no relation to Will's former Pinkerton supervisor, but who shared the same name in a coincidence that Will noted and did not comment on, told Delilah in his office that the embezzlement alone would support a sentence of 10 to 15 years in the Colorado Territorial Penitentiary. With the murder charges, and with the additional evidence Will could provide regarding Arthur Holt's death in Cheyenne, the sentence was likely to be longer than Gerald Jameson had years remaining to serve. He would die in prison. That was the accurate assessment. Delilah was at the prosecutor's office giving her initial statement when the arrest happened. Will sat in the hallway outside the office with his hat on his knee and did not think about much in particular, which was not something he was usually capable of. When she came out an hour later, she said, "It's done." He stood. "All of it?" "They have everything. Gerald is in county jail." She paused. "Fletcher says the preliminary hearing is in 2 weeks. The prosecutor wants me to stay in Denver for it." "Can you?" "Yes." She looked at him. "Can you?" He thought about his cattle and about Hank, who had been sent to his sister's, and about the ranch that had been sitting without supervision for the better part of 2 weeks. He thought about all the practical reasons that a rancher from the Utah Canyon country could not stay in Denver indefinitely. He said, "For 2 weeks, yes." She looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Something she had been holding carefully releasing slightly. "Good," she said. "Because there's still the matter of what Gerald said in his initial questioning that I need you to help me understand." That afternoon, Fletcher relayed to Delilah, in the small sitting room adjacent to the prosecutor's offices, what Gerald had said during the morning's intake interview. Gerald had been attempting to minimize, to reframe the events as a family dispute over inheritance that had been mischaracterized as something criminal. In the course of that recitation, he had confirmed, without appearing to understand what he was confirming, the essential content of the physician's letter. He had said that Eleanor had been weak, that she had made a choice he had not asked her to make, that her death was ultimately her own doing and the result of her own inadequacy. Delilah asked to receive this information alone. She went to the sitting room and closed the door, and Will sat outside in the hallway and waited, and did not try to listen, and did not try to anticipate what she would need when she came out. She was in there for 40 minutes. When she came out, she sat down next to him on the bench without preamble. She sat for a moment in silence, and he let the silence be what it was. "She wasn't running away from us," she said finally. "She was trying to protect us. She was wrong about the calculus. She thought that if she removed herself from the situation, Gerald would have what he wanted and leave my father and me alone. She was wrong about that. But she wasn't wrong about loving us enough to make a terrible choice for our sake." Will said nothing. "My whole life," she said, "I thought I was afraid of becoming her. Trapped and unhappy and with no way out. But that wasn't who she was. She wasn't trapped. She was fighting back with the only thing she had left, which was herself. She just didn't have anyone to stand beside her while she did it." She looked at him. "That's the difference," she said. He looked at her, and he thought about the train platform in October, and the creek bed, and the girl with the green eyes that had opened and assessed him in the same moment. And he thought about the cabin, and the notebook, and Castle Ford, and Ruth Bishop, and the list with his name on it. And he thought about the equipment shed in Crescent Junction, and the look she had given him over a distance of 30 feet, when he had been about to make the old mistake one more time. "Yes," he said, "that is the difference." 3 days later, Cole Draper rode into Denver and presented himself at the U.S. Marshal's office. He gave a full accounting of his arrangement with Gerald, the wartime incident Gerald had used as leverage, the money, the specific information he had passed, the names of the intermediaries. He was cooperative and thorough, and the prosecutor recommended a disposition that reflected the cooperation. Cole was convicted on 2 counts of accessory to criminal conspiracy and sentenced to 4 years in the Colorado Territorial Penitentiary at Cannon City. Will went to see him the day before he was transported. They sat across a table in the county jail with a guard at the door, and the particular quality of light that exists in rooms built specifically to contain people, flat and without direction. "You came," Cole said. "You came to Denver," Will said. "That counted." "Not enough." "No, but it was real, and it was your choice, and nobody made it for you." Will stood. "I'll write to you." "You don't have to." "I know." He put his hat on and walked out into the Denver afternoon, which smelled of coal smoke and horse and the particular industrial optimism of a city that was still becoming what it was going to be. 2 days before Will was due to ride back to Utah on a bright, cold October morning with the cottonwood trees along Cherry Creek losing their leaves in the methodical way of trees that do not feel the need to be dramatic about autumn. He and Delilah sat on a bench in a small park near the depot. She had a piece of bread she was not eating. He had coffee from a street cart that was genuinely terrible in the way of street cart coffee in cities where the person making it had not been required by their circumstances to learn to make it correctly, and he was drinking it anyway because he needed something to do with his hands. The cottonwood leaves moved above them. A woman with a perambulator passed on the path. A man in a banker's suit walked by quickly in the direction of the financial district without looking at anything that was not immediately in front of him. "You're going back to Utah," Delilah said. "I've got a winter count coming up on the herd. Hank's been at his sister's for 2 weeks. The ranch doesn't run itself." "I know." Silence. The cottonwood leaves. "I need to stay in Denver for the preliminary hearing. The prosecutor wants my personal testimony in 2 weeks. She paused. "After that, I need to begin the formal estate process for my father's bank. The sale could take several months to finalize. And I should go to Boston and see my aunt. She's been worried." "That's reasonable." "Will." He looked at her. "Say the thing you're not saying. You are the most contained man I have ever met. And I have watched you contain this particular thing for 3 days now, and I would like you to stop containing it." He set the terrible coffee down on the bench beside him. He looked at the cottonwood trees and then at her. "I have spent 10 years making sure I did not want anything I could lose," he said. "I was good at it. I thought it was wisdom. I know now it was a long way of punishing myself for Missouri in 1877, and I know that because you are the person who made me see it, not by telling me, but by looking at the truth of who I am without flinching and staying present. That is not a small thing. That is the thing." She waited. "I want you to come to Utah when you're finished here. I want you to see the ranch, not as a hiding place, but as something I built with my own hands and would like to show you. I want to find out whether what we are in a crisis is also what we are when nothing is trying to kill us." He met her eyes. "I am not asking you to give up the life you are going to build here. I am asking you to come and see mine. And then we decide together, with full information, what comes next." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll be in Utah by November," she said. "November is fine. And Will," she paused, "I want to read the notebook." He was quiet. "You read my letter," she said. "You sat with what it contained and you made a decision about it, and you were wrong about that decision, and you've acknowledged it. I'm not bringing that up as an accusation. I'm bringing it up as a reason." She looked at him steadily. "What's in that notebook is the whole of what you've been carrying alone. I don't think you should carry it alone anymore. I don't think that's serving you, and I don't think it's serving whatever it is you're trying to honor by keeping it." He thought about the notebook, the names and the dates and the 3 words after each one, the man with the lamp, the face. The inventory he had maintained for 6 years in the belief that keeping it was a form of accountability, and had come to understand, partly through sitting in Ruth Bishop's kitchen, and partly through watching this woman read her mother's truth by the window with her back straight, was something more complicated than accountability. It was also a form of isolation, a way of making himself too heavy for anyone to stand beside. "November," he said. "I'll have it out." She took his hand. She held it for a moment with a directness that was entirely characteristic of her, not asking anything by the holding except the acknowledgement that she was holding it. And then she let it go. She stood. She had a meeting with the estate attorneys at noon. "Go take care of your cattle," she said. "I'll see you in November." He watched her walk away along the path between the cottonwood trees, her back straight, her step certain, moving through the October morning with the specific quality of a person who knows where she is going. Will Xander rode out of Denver 2 mornings later before the city had fully woken up. The plains opened in front of him, heading west, and the mountains rose behind him against the early sky, and the trail ahead climbed gradually toward the plateau country, and then toward the canyon breaks, and then toward the red rock, and the silence he had built his life around. He rode differently than he had ridden in. He had ridden into Denver carrying the particular weight of a man moving toward something he could not see clearly and was not certain he was equal to. He was riding out carrying something different, not lighter exactly, but differently distributed. The weight of the notebook was still there. The weight of Thomas Bishop's face, of the man with the lamp, of Arthur Holt, and the report he had refused to sign. All of that was still there and would remain there because those were facts. And facts did not resolve themselves simply because a person arrived at a better relationship with them. But the weight had a context now that it had not had before. It was being carried inside a larger structure, and the larger structure was not simply the canyon and the silence and the distance he had placed between himself and the consequences of what he had done. It was something he was still in the process of building, with a person who knew what he was building it out of, and had chosen to be present for the building. Ranger found his pace on the western trail, and Will settled into the saddle and let the horse work. The desert spread out around him in all directions, red and brown and amber in the morning light, enormous and patient and entirely indifferent to human difficulty, which was one of the reasons Will had come to love it. The canyon country did not care about your history. It did not assign meaning to what you had done or grant absolution for it. It simply was what it was. And it would be here when you arrived and when you left, and long after both. But for the first time in 10 years, the silence in front of him did not feel like the silence of a man who has removed himself from the world in order to avoid breaking any more of it. It felt like the space between a question and its answer. It felt like waiting for something good. November, he thought. The canyon country in November was cold and clear, and the red rock walls held a particular light in the short afternoons that was unlike any other light in any other season. He had watched it alone for 3 years, and had thought it beautiful in the specific, diminished way that beauty registers when there is no one to turn to and say, "Look at that." He thought about a woman riding in on the Western Trail in November, and seeing the canyon for the first time in that light. And he thought about what he would say when she did. And he thought that what he would say was probably nothing, that they would both sit on the horses and look at it together, and that the looking together would be sufficient. He had been riding away from things for 10 years. It was a considerable change to be riding toward something instead. Ranger moved west through the brightening morning, and the miles gathered behind them, and the canyon country rose ahead. And Will Xander rode toward it with his back straight and his hands easy on the reins, and the particular quality of attention in his face that belonged to a man who has stopped looking over his shoulder and started looking at the horizon. Not because the past was gone, because the horizon was real, and November was coming.